Nearly. This week, I'll be going through 5 reasons why you probably shouldn't buy the Lumix S1 in 2021. First of all, let's start with a disclaimer. I do currently own the Lumix S1, I'm using it right now. Whilst the title of this video might imply that I don't like the camera, that is completely incorrect. Instead, what this video will do is subjectively highlight some of its limitations and disadvantages, which are completely dependent on a person's needs for a camera. And these aren't all limitations to me personally, but definitely could be for other people. And then, cause I'm a decent guy and I don't like to leave you hanging, I'll explain how other cameras from Panasonic within their Lumix lineup may help combat some of those limitations. I've also chosen not to include the Panasonic S1R within the video, and whilst it's primarily a photography camera with some really good video features built in, I don't really want to recommend a camera that I don't know much about. So let's start off with number 3. No, I'm joking. First off is the LCD screen. The Panasonic S1 is limited to a tiltable LCD screen, which by now we all know isn't necessarily the best type of screen to have if you're a vlogger or someone who constantly wants to check their frame, and especially if they're the ones in front of the camera. A flip out LCD screen is the better option to have. You can bring the screen out, tilt it, and it also flips out on a little bracket for it to face out to the right a little bit. But I personally never use that at all. To me, it just doesn't make sense, especially for video shooters, because if you're holding it with your right hand on the grip, ergonomically, it just doesn't make sense for it to twist that way. I feel like that's going to block the screen and I'm just not a fan of it. Right now, I have the Ninja 5 set up underneath the camera so I can check my framing and see how I'm looking on camera. No, but any external monitor is going to come at an additional cost. So you just have to bear that in mind if you did decide to go down the route of the S1. Thankfully, the Panasonic S5 and the S1H do both have flip out screens, with the S1H going one further by having both a flip and a tilt. It's nice. Next up is slow-mo. With the Lumix S1, you have what is known as high-speed video, which gives you a range of recording rates to shoot in slow motion. The issue that I find with the S1 though, in comparison to other cameras that I've used, is that you are limited to the amount of options available of those frame rates to shoot in. In full HD, I personally wouldn't ever go above 125 frames per second, because after then, the quality significantly drops. And these high frame rate modes don't come with audio either, and if you were after audio, the maximum frame rate that you can do both in 4K and in full HD is 60 frames per second. If high frame rate recording with audio is something that you're after, then the S1H will be the better option, because that does provide that option. Additionally, if your budget is limited, then it makes sense for me to mention the GH5, the GH5S and the GH5 Mark II, because all of these also shoot in high frame rate and give you more flexibility in the number of frames that you want to record in, rather than the limited amount you get with the S1. Of course, the GH5 is a whole new system with it being Micro Four Thirds. However, I just wanted to mention it if the flexibility in that high frame rate is something that you're really wanting. Up next, which is kind of 2B rather than 3, is continuing with its slow motion features, but that is its limitation of an 8-bit codec. I'm sure at this point some people are saying, well, he's asking a bit much from this camera, and yes, maybe I am a little bit. The reason I've mentioned it in this video is in light of the recent firmware update. Hear me out. All users of the Lumix S range have recently been given free firmware updates, with the Lumix S1's firmware update considered as one of the most impressive. This particular update future-proofs the S1 for a few more years to come, now with the option to shoot 5.9K internally and also up to 12-bit externally. On paper, having a camera with that level of resolution in video may result in general camera enthusiasts and not necessarily professionals expecting all resolutions lower than that to have the option to shoot in 10-bit. Essentially, I'm just looking out for anyone who might have heard of this firmware update, which was released after the releases of the A7S III and the Canon R5, which have 10-bit high frame rate recording modes internally within them, and just assume that this newer firmware update would match the specs of those major competitors. Just like in my previous video, I do want to mention the music provider that I'm using for my YouTube channel, which is Uppbeat. Uppbeat.io is a free music platform for content creators, YouTube, TikTok and other social media channels. They've got some cracking music on there that I'm never short of choosing for these types of videos. So take a look, have a listen, and if you feel that they will improve the quality of your videos like I feel like they are doing mine, then be sure to sign up using the link below. Actually, really quickly, the video is not sponsored by Uppbeat. I just want to publicize them and show them off because they are great. So back to 5 reasons why you probably shouldn't purchase a Lumix S1 in 2021, and number 4 is the actual size of the camera. It is a bulky camera, and if you did decide to explore the external options that you can have with the S1, such as the Ninja 5, the XLR1 audio input, or even a cage system, the weight is only going to increase more and more. Whilst the S1 is both smaller and lighter than the S1H, Panasonic have also released the Lumix S5, which is much smaller and lighter than the S1. This is where the size of a camera, in my opinion, becomes a really important factor for you to consider, as it can be entirely dependent on not only the type of content that you shoot, but the style in which you shoot as well. If, for instance, you're a wedding videographer and you like to keep everything as light and as small as possible, then the S5 will be more favourable to you. But if you primarily shoot with a handheld style for those wedding videos and you prefer better stabilisation, then a slightly bigger camera body will reduce that shakiness even more, and therefore bringing the S1 back into contention. There are actually tests online that show the S1 having better IBIS performance than the S5. But to me, it would be interesting to see how the increased body size of the S1 actually contributes to that. As another example, if you're primarily a corporate filmmaker who shoots lots of interviews, for instance, then the size of a camera body may not be as much of a concern, because you might not be holding it handheld for as often or on a gimbal. Plus, if you really like to rig up your camera systems with rods, follow focus systems, handles, matte boxes, the heavier weight of the S1 isn't as much of a concern anymore, and then the S1's advantage of having a full-sized HDMI port then makes much more sense to go with. The 5th and final limitation of the Lumix S1 in this video is the media storage. Now, I appreciate that this isn't as much of an issue for a lot of people, but to me, moving from the Lumix GH5 to the S1 resulted in me also having to spend quite a lot of money on XQD cards. It does now also support CF Express Type B cards. However, I personally chose to go down the XQD route because I eventually want to own a Sony FX9 camera. For when that eventually happens, I will have a decent collection of cards already built up for my next camera purchase. Therefore, if you're currently an SD card only user and you want to remain that way for the foreseeable, it then makes more sense for you to either get the S5 or the S1H, because both of those have dual SD card slots. To summarise, the Lumix S1, in my opinion, still holds up against some of the other renowned full-frame mirrorless cameras out there. These areas mostly being its low light performance, its resolution capabilities in video, and also its bit depth in those resolutions, when considering that the price of this camera is under £2,000 and in some cases under 1,500 quid when they have promotions such as cashback offers on. But it's not the best in some other areas, which is understandable considering that price point, but that's why this video has been made. So if this helps anyone out there in making a decision on what camera to buy, as long as I've not encouraged them to move away from Panasonic, I'll be happy. Of course, everyone has future plans, and will the Lumix S1 be a part of that for me? Yes, but not forever. I've made some great work over the last 12 months with this camera, but it's only going to get me so far. That's why it's always so important that you make the right decision when it comes to these types of purchases. Naturally, newer camera releases from the announcement of the S1 will now make the S1 seem out of date. However, it's really important to realise that the Lumix S1 is still an absolute workhorse of a camera. As always, I do hope you've enjoyed the video. Make sure that you do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There's lots more content, especially around the Lumix S1 and other filmmaking tutorials and tips and things like that. So subscribe to the channel if you've yet to do so, and in that case, I will see you in the next video. Or unless I just randomly pop up in your feed. And if I do, thank you, algorithm. Take care, guys, and I'll see you soon.